Welcome to Affordable Housing Development 101. This webinar has been organized by the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust and Van City Community Investment Bank to provide board and staff members of Parkdale-based partner organizations with an overview of the key concepts and considerations of affordable housing development. The webinar content has been kindly developed and will be presented by staff at CADCO, an Ottawa-based nonprofit development corporation. CADCO has a multidisciplinary team of affordable housing and real estate experts. CADCO brings the experience of CCCO as well as experience working with a number of nonprofit groups and charities to develop affordable housing and social purpose real estate projects across Ontario and Quebec. Next slide, please. So this is the first webinar of a series entitled Affordable Housing Development for Nonprofit Boards. It consists of 3 two-hour webinars on the topics of Affordable Housing Development 101, Finance, Funding, and Partnerships, and then the last activity will be Good Stewardship of Community Assets. The idea for these board trainings were proposed 1 year ago as part of a meeting with local nonprofits hosted by the Van City Community Investment Bank. The bank asked us to identify opportunities and challenges in developing more affordable housing. Amazingly, multiple groups identified interest and concrete opportunities to acquire or develop new affordable housing. But we also identified a dire need to build the capacity of our boards to consider the risks and benefits of affordable housing projects. After all, real estate projects are complex and put new demand on nonprofit boards such as the approval of major investments, new partnerships, financing, and long-term commitments to the community. At each decision point, board members must feel confident that the risks and benefits are acceptable. To assure informed and effective governance, it is critical that our board members are well informed about affordable housing development, financing, and long-term stewardship. We organize these trainings in response to this need, and it is our hope that by providing these trainings, we will all be more prepared to develop successful affordable housing projects in Parkdale and beyond. I'd like to thank VCIB and Maytree Foundation for supporting this series as funders. I'd also like to invite Jake Stacy, Vice President of Impact Banking at Van City Community Investment Bank, to say a few words about why VCIB has supported this initiative. For a little bit of context, Van City Community Investment Bank is a national values-based impact bank with a mission to use its tools of finance to drive immediate and lasting social and environmental change in communities. Jake, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Josh. Thank you very much. It's lovely to see all of these interesting people from different parts of our community on one call. So bravo, Josh, for bringing diverse people, diverse minds and backgrounds together. This is what always makes these experiences rich. I would first like to acknowledge the First Peoples lands I'm calling in from. The Huron-Wendat, the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I pay my respects to elders both past and present. This land acknowledgement holds much importance as I reflect on the events that have been unfolding in the US and Canada over the last few weeks. At the bank, we've been talking a lot about the impact of painful and ugly truth that racism has come into a harsh new light and what that means. At the bank, we know it cannot be ignored. We all have responsibility to facilitate meaningful change for our communities, myself as a leader, for the employees of our organizations, clients, customers, stakeholders, and community members who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Josh, I want to thank you so much and the rest of the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust group for organizing this webinar series with us. To all of the staff and board members from Parkdale-based partner organizations who have joined us, welcome, thank you. I'm happy you're all here. As Josh said, my name is Jake Stacy and I'm the Vice President of Van City Community Investment Bank, but you can call us VCIB. Before I say a few words about the hows and whys of today, I have a couple of team members on the webinar tonight who are the people that make a lot of our transactions happen, that have major impact in the communities that we work with. So I wanted to take a moment and have them introduce themselves, if you don't mind. I see Eric and I saw Caroline. So do you two want to say hello and introduce yourselves, please?
Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm Director of Lending at VCIB. Nice to meet everybody.
Hi, I'm Eric. I work with Caroline and Jake, and I'm on the lending team as Senior Account Manager. Nice to see everyone.
Excellent. Caroline, we don't have anyone else, do we? Can you see
I
anyone
think
else?
Alfred's here.
Alfred
here. Pardon?
Hi, everyone.
There he is.
Hi, Alfred.
Alfred, I muted you by accident. You have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Perfect. Hi. Hi, everyone. My name's Alfred Lee. I'm also the Senior Account Manager with Vancity Community Investment Bank.
Excellent, thank you. And so for those of you who have not had the pleasure of working with the brilliant team at VCIB, these are just a few of them. We have even more. They're some of the best kept secrets in financial services, and I'd like to keep it that way. So don't spread too many, don't spread too much news about any of them, because I don't want them going anywhere. We need to keep doing miracles like we do in Parkdale. So as Josh mentioned, VCIB is a values-driven bank. And right now, more than ever, we're hearing a lot about purpose. We're hearing a lot about values. But one of the things that makes VCIB very different is we were founded on purpose. And our whole entire mandate, our vision is to finance a sustainable tomorrow. But our mission is really about using traditional tools of finance to do things differently, to structure deals differently, to move change forward differently. And it's something that we do each day, and we take it quite seriously. And how we do that is we work with organizations who build and operate affordable housing. We work with organizations who create community hubs, innovative green building projects, and we are a proud partner of the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust. In 2019, VCIB supported the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust with financing, advice, and support. We continue to do that as the organization made its first residential acquisition of a 15-unit rooming house on Maynard Avenue, now permanently preserved as affordable housing. Those are the kind of things in our office that you see, groups of people standing up and cheering about and clapping our hands when we get to accomplish things that are that meaningful for us. And as Josh mentioned, last fall, we brought together a group of passionate Parkdale community representatives. And what we did was we discussed supporting efforts to advance the community's vision of not only expanding affordable housing, but defending that position in the Parkdale community. Not only now in the immediate state, but also into the future. And that links wonderfully with the bank's vision of financing a sustainable tomorrow. So from that discussion, it became apparent that board members across the not-for-profit segment who are interested in affordable housing, and I've heard early on the webinar as people were coming on, that we've got organizations here tonight that are asset rich. They've got assets and they don't quite know what to do with them. And we often hear that as a community investment bank. So it's not only about being informed about affordable housing development, but the financing, long-term stewardship to ensure more successful affordable housing projects in Parkdale. And we're thrilled that all of you could join us this evening to take part in this meaningful discussion with the partners that we have on the phone. For us, this session couldn't have come at a better of time. Recent research brief from the Toronto Foundation, who we worked closely with throughout the pandemic, estimates that thousands of renters have been struggling to make monthly payments since April because jobs have been lost or people are working fewer hours due to the impacts of the pandemic. COVID-19 has just exacerbated some of the challenges for affordable housing we've seen grown over the last few decades. And we at VCIB believe it's really accelerated the issue as well. But on a hopeful note, the brief also outlined that COVID-19 crisis will lead to inventive measures to solve the problem of affordable housing in Toronto. And it's also been noted that the pandemic has led to lower rents on some of the new apartments that are coming onto the market. One of these measures outlined in the brief is the opportunity for not-for-profit organizations to buy properties that remain as affordable housing. And I want to thank all of you for attending tonight and the efforts you're making to drive progress in affordable housing in Parkdale and other parts of Toronto as well. I look forward to our meaningful and exciting learnings that'll come out of these sessions, and I hope to continue to support all of you throughout this journey. And as I did introduce a few of the team members at the bank tonight, we're all here to support you not only in these conversations, but in inquiries, advice, direction going forward. So if you're interested in learning more about VCIB, please do stay in touch. You can visit our website at vcib.ca, or you can connect with me directly on LinkedIn under Jake Stacy, and I can point you in the right direction of the individuals who to speak to on our team, or I'd be happy to have a virtual coffee chat anytime. So please enjoy the session. And thank you again, Josh, for my introduction. And I'm really excited to hear what our partners from CADCO have to say this evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jake. Really appreciate that amazing introduction. And if we could just move to the next slide, I would like to introduce our presenters today. So Graham Hussey is the Director of Housing Development at CCCO and the President of CADCO. He is a Board Director of Housing Services Corporation and former board member of the Ottawa Alliance to End Homelessness. Graham's educational background is in environmental engineering and project management, and he has 15 years experience in developing and managing social enterprises in the affordable housing, social investment, and food security sectors. Graham's leadership has been recognized by the Maytree Foundation, Ontario Cooperative Association, and Toronto Food Policy Council. Thanks for being here, Graham. Anna Froelich is the project manager at CADCO and CCCO. Anna has a master's degree in urban and regional planning and a diverse professional background in the private sector development planning, municipal planning, community engagement, and international experience with the Federal Planning Agency of Grenada. Beyond a commitment to developing affordable housing, she has a strong interest in opportunities for integrating affordable and environmental sustainability. Anna is a registered professional planner and a member of the Ontario Professional Planners Institute and the Canadian Institute of Planners. Anna has worked on various projects for faith groups, supportive housing, seniors housing, and youth housing. Thank you, Anna, for being here. The stage is both of yours.
Thanks, Josh. First of all, what a great intro, and I'm super excited to be here. When Josh invited us, I had no idea how many people from all these different organizations in the diocese and so forth would join us. I thought we were going to present to the Parkdale's Neighbourhood Land Trust board. So super big surprise, but I'm even more excited about that. Most of these things are kind of being covered by Josh, but just in case if you have any technical difficulties, feel free to type it into the chat. It might be found in different spots, but on my screen, it's kind of in the center at the bottom. We have a few kind of places during our presentation that we've kind of going to take a pause for questions that are kind of in logical spots. But if along the way you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. And then when we get to that point, it allows us to kind of answer questions faster because we can kind of just answer them as a group. Feel free to do that. And also Kyla's on the line on the call with us from our team as well. And she's going to monitor the chat box. So if there's questions she can answer just through the chat, she'll do that as we go. In general, if you want to keep your screens on or your camera on, that's great. If not, no worries. And try and mute yourself just during the presentation because it prevents the background noise. Yeah, we'll get started. Go ahead, Anna, to the next slide. First of all, I'm really excited to do this because, of course, of the organization being based in Parkdale. I don't think it's in my bio in any way, but I don't know if people know that I actually lived in the neighborhood for quite a long time. My oldest son's middle name is Sororin. IL Dinner, who's on this call with us. We're the founders of the West End Food Co-op and the Sororin Farmers Market in the neighborhood. And actually, even before that, I was one of Maytree's Leaders for Change. So it's kind of funny how all these things come together into one virtual room. Anna and Kyla and I, we're based in Ottawa, so we're joining you from Ottawa. But what we're going to share tonight is knowledge that will help you develop an affordable housing project, whether it's Ottawa or Toronto or any of the other provinces. It's kind of the basics, really distilled into the basics. And a lot of the basics of developing affordable housing is the same as the basics of developing market housing. So we're going to kind of talk about how they're similar and in some cases slightly different. You'll learn that. You'll learn a methodology and how you can make your affordable housing project financially viable, an analysis of how to fund and finance affordable housing development, and we're going to share some recent examples of projects that were successfully completed. It is part of a three-part series, and we've given different versions of this first part quite a bit over the years at conferences and with many of our clients and other groups. The financial piece is usually the biggest challenge. How do you fund and finance affordable housing? And so having that second session that's going to really just dig deep and focus on that will be great. So tonight we'll kind of cover the basics of that, but we're going to get into it in real detail in that second session, which I think we're scheduling in September after the summer break. Go ahead, Anna. This is what we're intending to cover tonight, an overall kind of introduction to who we are and our experiences. We're going to talk about what is affordable housing. There's many terms and many definitions, so we're going to try and lay that out and so people can understand what that involves. We're going to talk about the process of development. What are the stages that you need to go through to create a project, from the initial idea to the operations and people living in the apartments. We're going to talk about the development team. That's really, from my perspective, the key. If you have a good team, you can figure all the rest out. So we'll talk about who's on a team and what their roles and responsibilities are. We're going to cover the basics of what are the types of costs and where do the sources of money come, again, focused on affordable housing, and then share some examples. Go ahead, Anna. So just starting with a little bit of an introduction of CADCO and what we do, if you can advance the slide. We're a nonprofit real estate developer. We're based in Ottawa, as we've said, but as Josh said in his introduction, we're working on projects in other cities and places in Ontario and even into Quebec. We work on affordable rental housing, which is for the most part what we do, but we also have experience doing affordable home ownership. If you're not as familiar with that, that would be like a Habitat for Humanity, or in Toronto, an Options for Homes. Those are examples of affordable home ownership. We're related to a nonprofit affordable housing landlord called CCOC, or Centertown Citizens Ottawa Corporation. And we do the development for CCOC. Sometimes we do it for ourselves as affordable home ownership, but most often we're doing it for other nonprofits and co-ops and charities. These are groups maybe like yourselves. It could be faith organizations. We're doing a lot of work with the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa. They have maybe the capacity to operate the housing, but what they're lacking is both the expertise and the time to create the new affordable housing. And so that's what our role is, and that's kind of the experience we're bringing to this presentation. Go ahead, Anna. As a bit of a, just if you're wondering, it's not that we're inexperienced, there's just a little bit of a lag as slides progress from when Anna clicks it to how Zoom interprets that. But CCOC, Centertown Citizens Ottawa Corporation, we're a private nonprofit landlord. What I mean by that is we're not associated with any level of government, such as a Toronto community housing. We're like Parkdale's Neighbourhood Land Trust. We have a board. It's comprised, it's elected from our membership. And for us, you only have to pay $3 a year. You can join and be a member. That our members are tenants, but also lots of community members who aren't tenants are members. So you don't have to be a tenant to be a member. We were created in the early 1970s. We own over 50 properties and 1,600 units, and we operate that, but we also do property management for other groups. And so we operate about 2,000 units of housing in downtown Ottawa. Our model of affordable housing, because affordable housing can mean a lot of different things, we like to call it mixed housing. I like to use the analogy that if you take everybody who lives in Ottawa, which is like Toronto, where maybe don't have as many visible minorities, but we're a very kind of diverse economically, racially, households, all those different abilities. If you kind of put those all into a snow globe and you shake it up, and it's a snow globe because we live in Ottawa, that's who lives at CCOC. We have some market rental housing where people might pay a rent that's similar to a CMHC average market rent. We have some apartments that are rented at a discount or where people might get a subsidy from there depending on how much their household income is. And we have housing for single people, which might be seniors or young people. And we have housing for families. And we're a nonprofit landlord. We don't do support services, but we partner with over 12 different community agencies who support tenants in our buildings. And this photo is of our kind of flagship project, the Beaver Barracks. It's actually right beside the Museum of Nature. If you're wondering what that kind of stone-like castle building is in the back, that at one point was our Parliament building when Parliament Hill burned down. And we'll talk a bit more about this project later as one of the examples. Go ahead, Anna. These are many of the clients that we're working with now. A lot of them are in Ottawa, but not all of them. There's a lot of different types of organizations who provide many different types of housing. It could be mixed housing like CCOC or supportive housing for a particular demographic. We've had a lot of experience developing seniors housing projects, some of them in Ottawa, not all of these are in Ottawa. We've done some projects that you would call kind of more social purpose real estate. They're not necessarily housing as a focus, but we have a nonprofit or a charitable client who's creating a real estate project that has some social and community benefit. And as I was saying, we're doing a lot of work with the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa. Go ahead, Anna.
So I'll take over from here. Thanks, Graham. We wanted to spend a little bit of time on a bit of background talking about what is affordable housing. It's a catch-all term. It's used to describe a wide range of housing. And so just taking the time to focus in on what it means and what it is that we're talking about today. So this slide shows CMHC's housing continuum. You might have seen this image before. It's used in a number of CMHC presentations and around. It's basically a linear representation of tenuousness of tenure. So on the left, you see homeless, so people who don't have a roof over their heads. And on the right is market home ownership. It's not a perfect model. We'll discuss that a bit on the next slide. But it's really the housing types in that dashed blue box that we're talking about today and that are usually what people mean when they talk about affordable housing. So this is still quite a wide range. You can see emergency shelters and transitional housing, which are often housing types that don't have a lease. It's shorter term housing. Social housing, which is a bit of a dated term. Usually when people talk about social housing, they're referring to the bigger, formerly municipally run or still municipally run social housing providers that often have an operating subsidy. You see, affordable rental housing is kind of the bulk of what we're talking about today. That's what CCOC does. And so usually that's housing where there might be a rent subsidy, but there isn't an operating subsidy typically involved. And then also you can see affordable home ownership, which we're not going to talk about so much today, but there are a lot of similarities. And that's if you think about Habitat for Humanity or Options for Homes in Toronto, those are examples of affordable home ownership. So, and the housing continuum isn't an ideal model. It's because really that it doesn't represent a linear path. Some people maybe move through those different steps, but the ideal doesn't necessarily have to be market home ownership for everyone. Some people move through that continuum in different ways, and some people will stay in supportive housing for the rest of their life, and that's a great success for them. So this is CMHC's wheelhouse model, and they're sort of trying to demonstrate those three different categories. So the safety net is really those short-term emergency shelter, short-term supportive housing types. And then housing with supports can be either longer-term, long-term supportive housing where people have sort of supports to help have a successful tenancy, sort of supports with living or managing, or just subsidized rental housing. So independent apartment living, but with a rent support. And then the third category they have is market housing, which can be ownership or rental. Within any of these three categories, the housing can be what's referred to as mixed housing. So what Graham was talking about through CCOC and the example with Beaver Barracks. And that's when, you know, anyone potentially can live there, all different types of people. Or any of these housing types could also be specific to one group of people. You know, it could be women's housing or seniors housing or Indigenous housing. And that's more typically seen with supportive housing, but not always. So that kind of brings us a little bit into who lives in affordable housing. It really is everyone, again, as Graham was talking about, in a mixed model. But the groups that are listed on the slide here are the priority categories from the National Housing Strategy. So it's worth just being aware of who those groups are, and that sometimes the housing developments can be targeted at specific groups, one or more. But affordability doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. So with different people with different needs, the definition of affordability isn't always the same. Kind of the typical benchmark, general definition is that affordable housing is spending no more than 30% of your gross household income on shelter. And that can be the case if you're like going out for a market mortgage. You know, generally the banks look to lend you not more than 30% of your household income. It's also kind of the way that rent geared to income, or RGI, was calculated. We're typically moving away from that model because it's difficult to administer. Everyone has a different income. People's incomes change throughout the year. And so that's kind of the older model of subsidized housing. In Ottawa, the city defines affordability for their funding programs based on average market rent. So CMHC's average market rent, which looks at the rental rates for all apartments in the area, including new builds or really old apartments that might be in terrible condition. So it really lumps everything together. We often find that AMR is significantly lower than the actual rent that could be charged, especially for a new build. Like if you're developing a new build, if you went out on the market and charged as much as you could, it's usually higher than AMR, but often in an affordable housing development, rents are capped at AMR. To come up with an affordable rent, we often hear the term below market rent, or BMR, which is often calculated as 80% of that AMR number. Sometimes 70% is used, and that's the rate that's set for subsidized rental units in an affordable housing project. CMHC also uses median market rent, which is similar to AMR. Often it's really close, and if you look at the slide, this is showing actual rental statistics for one-bedroom units in Toronto, and you can see that the difference between MMR and AMR is not too far apart. But often with the MMR, CMHC wants you to look at neighborhood level, whereas sometimes AMR is calculated citywide. So that's something to be aware of, and sometimes on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, there can be quite a difference there. But if you look along the bottom of that slide, we've also tried to show, you know, at that 30% of gross household income, how much does somebody need to make to afford at an affordable rate, you know, that one-bedroom unit. You can see that even at a BMR rate in Toronto, you need to be making $43,000 a year. And for a single person, we know lots of people still don't make that much. And so often in affordable housing, some units are set below that rate at, you know, the Ontario Works or Ontario Disability Support Program, ODSP, shelter allowance rates, which are shown there on the slide. So often supportive housing is really at those lower rates, and sometimes in a mixed housing model, you'll have a combination of those different rates, so that there's some units that are affordable to different people. So this next slide is showing some, you know, fairly dire statistics for the City of Toronto. And this is from Housing Toronto's Report for Action that was published in 2019. So more than 7,500 individuals used shelters any given night last year. There are over 100,000 households on the wait list for subsidized affordable housing, and the wait list is currently between 7 and 10 years to actually get housing. And then also know that 194,000 households are paying more than 50% of their income on housing. So that's way beyond the rate that's considered affordable. So that kind of gives just a really high level background and understanding on what we're talking about when we mean affordable housing. So it's a whole different range of housing types. And what is affordable really
Anna, I think you're frozen.
I think we, yeah.
Lost Anna for a moment.
It may be because there's so many people with their video on.
housing.
Josh.
Oh, she's back.
Hi, Anna.
Oh,
You just,
Anna,
you
you're
just,
frozen for a bit.
That's unfortunate. Am I back now?
yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you just want to do the takeaway slide again. That's
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Hopefully I'll stick around. I'll try. So the takeaways from that section, that was really just intended to give kind of a bit of a common background and understanding of what affordable housing is and what we're talking about today. I think really that there are a range of different kinds of housing that are all fall within that definition of affordable housing. That affordability varies by household and individual. So what is affordable, it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. And that there's such a great need for housing. Those statistics made that clear. And we know that that need is going up faster than we're able to build new housing. And it's needed in all types of housing. So from seniors housing, supportive housing, family housing, there's a need there. So we did want to just pause now to see whether anyone had questions on that section. And I think Kyla's been monitoring that.
Yeah, no questions on the chat box just yet.
Okay, so we'll keep going on, and if anyone does have any questions, there'll be another opportunity at the end. So feel free to come back to this stuff if you like. So, you know, really that background was intended to demonstrate that there's a need. I think everyone here on this call is very much aware of that, and everyone's really here to understand what we can do about it. How can we build and develop more affordable housing successfully? So this next section is sort of going to walk through what the development process is, what are the major stages, and what happens at each stage of that process. So just to back it up to really the fundamental components, any development project, affordable housing or not, needs these three basic components. So you need money, you need capital to build your project, you need land where the project is going to be built, and you need capacity. So who's going to see the project through? Do you or your group have the necessary knowledge, experience, and time and resources to see a project through? Sometimes we like to think of this as a three-legged stool. If you're missing any one of those three components, your project is not going to stand up and you won't be able to move forward. So to get there, to build your project, there's a process that involves multiple stages. You know, no one can just have an idea and stick a shovel in the ground the next day. There's a lot of work that it takes to get to that point. So we think of this in 4 distinct phases of the development process. So you have design analysis and feasibility, design development, construction, and then operations. And we've displayed it here on a little bit of a timeline, and you'll notice that there's a lot of variability in that timeline. So, you know, we're showing design analysis and feasibility taking anywhere between 2 months or 2+ years, sometimes many more than that. And it really does take some groups years to get through this process. And often that has to do with missing one of those legs of that stool. You know, groups will come and they'll have a site and they know what they want to do, but they don't have money or something. And really at this stage, it's where you need to figure out having all of those three legs in place. And that's when you're able to move on. Design development is when you know that you have those three legs in place and where you bring on many of the other consultants and work out the design details of the project. We're going to get into these in more detail on the next slides, but just a quick overview here. Construction is pretty self-explanatory. It usually takes about a year and a half while your project's being built. And then the fourth stage, operations, is when the building's up and running and people move in. CADCO is usually involved in those first three stages of the project, and then the fourth is when the housing provider really takes on full control of their project. We also think of these four stages as key risk analysis milestones. So you need to be sure that you're ready to move on before you commit what's often sort of really the next magnitude of money and time and resources to a project. So, you know, when you start in feasibility, you put in a little bit of money and time to figure it out, but before you hire all your consultants and move forward, you need to know that you're ready. So in the design analysis and feasibility phase, this is when you flesh out what your project is going to be. So this phase does start at that first instant when a project is conceived, and different groups get there in different ways. And we heard that already from when people were introducing themselves a little bit. Some groups, you know, maybe have a specific population that they serve and they see a need and they really want to build housing to serve that group. Other groups maybe have land and they know they want to do something, maybe they know they want to do affordable housing, but they don't really know what they want to do with it. You know, other groups maybe have money and want to build affordable housing, but they don't know where that's going to be. So once you have an idea, it's really about figuring out how to pull all of those other pieces together. During this phase, you need to identify your site if you don't already have it. And often you'll do site investigation studies to know what you're working with. So, you know, doing geotechnical report to know what kind of foundations you're going to need, or if there's contamination in the soil. If you have a building or you're acquiring a building for an adaptive reuse, then you want to do a building conditions assessment to know, you know, what is it that you're working with. You usually bring an architect on board or someone to do early design concept work, even if it's just the massing of what you're going to build. So you don't get into the detailed design yet, but you need to figure out what you can build. So you look at city planning regulations and zoning. And during this phase, you usually want to reach out to some other partners, whether that's the municipality or others, to understand the needs and what's permitted on the site. You'll need to create an initial pro forma or financial model, and Graham's going to talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But to understand whether you can make the project work financially and where the money is going to come from to build your project. And it's really only when you're able to answer all of these questions that you'll go to your board if you're a not-for-profit or a charity and get the approval to move on from the feasibility stage, knowing that you have a project that can go ahead. So we wanted to sort of illustrate these different phases a little bit based on a project that we've worked on. This is the Youth Services Bureau Youth Hub in Ottawa, and it's a project that I worked on. That finished construction in 2019. It's a supportive housing for youth development, and with a ground floor youth service hub that YSB runs. So in this picture, you can kind of see a concept level plan. So you can see that the building is really, you know, it's a little bit more than just a box, but not much. None of the details are fleshed out. But you're starting to understand what the scale, what the massing might be, where you might have some amenity space. And often you go through multiple concepts, and Graham's going to talk about that a little bit later on as well. This isn't even exactly what the building looks like by the time it was built. The concept changed a bit. You go through that and you need to change things. But, you know, as an example of that feasibility stage and some of the work you might do then. So once you're through feasibility and you've answered those questions and you know, okay, we can make this project work, then you enter the design development phase. And this is when you really work on finalizing and refining the architectural design of the building. So your architect and the consultant design team really takes a lead role during this phase. It's also the time when you formalize any partnerships that might be part of the project. So maybe you have a couple of groups working together, or you have a group, you know, a support services group, and you need to make sure the details of that. This is when you'd want to be working that out. If you need to purchase land and you haven't done it already, this is when you would close on the deal and sign those sale agreements. You also work through throughout the design development process on finalizing the budget based on the architectural design. So when you develop those initial pro formas based on the concept, none of the design details are ready. You don't necessarily know what the cladding is going to be, and exactly the size and all of the specs of the building. And so as that design progresses, you usually go through a series of cost estimates to get closer and closer to reality and what the final number will be. And having your construction manager involved at this stage is really helpful for costing. I think that's a best practice that we may talk about again, but that's helpful to have your construction manager on board. This is also when you go through any municipal approvals that are required. So if a zoning requirement is required, or site plan, you'd be working through that during the design development phase. And usually this takes you all the way up until construction. So at the end of the design development phase is when the construction manager will be going out to tender and actually hiring all of the groups, the sub-trades, the builders who will do the construction of the project. So this is another example from the Bureau project of just showing a much more detailed architectural building drawing. So this project, as it's supportive housing for youth, and a lot of them were youth who were formerly homeless or at risk of homelessness, and most youth aren't carrying around a whole bunch of furniture, so they actually built in furniture to each of these bachelor units, and you can kind of see that in the picture. There are built-in beds and dressers and kitchen and a slide-out table, and so during design development all of those details are worked out. Construction phase is pretty self-explanatory. It's when your building is actually under construction. And at this point, the project transitions from the architect being the lead to the construction manager who's in charge of day-to-day construction. During this phase, there is still work to be done from the housing provider. If you're part of a group that sort of would be the developer of a project, there's still work beyond just the construction. You still need to monitor construction administration to make sure that all of the contracts are in place. You're monitoring the scope, schedule, and budget as construction progresses. And there are always unexpected changes that come up and need to be evaluated and approved. There are testing and inspections that happens. You're still dealing with the municipality and permits such as demolition or occupancy. And then near the end of construction, there's work that has to happen to get ready for rent up, to deal with deficiencies, so making sure that the work is up to standard, and then monitoring the final budget to confirm that the project really was completed within budget. So this is just a picture of that YSB building nearing the end of construction, which was an exciting time. And then once construction's done, the building moves into operation. So this is when the housing provider or the client takes back control of the site and the building. At the beginning, there's a lot of work during that first year, that you have to rent up all of the units. There's still some work related to construction, especially in that first year. So commissioning of all of the systems, which is the testing and balancing of your HVAC and your security system and all of those pieces, confirming that all of the documentation and manuals are in place. And then that first year is a warranty period. So if there are any flaws in construction that have to be resolved, you're still often working really closely with the construction manager to make sure all of that gets wrapped up properly. And then the first year of anything is, a bit tricky. You're going through all your processes for the first time. So, property management, rentals, maintenance, and smoothing out all the kinks for the operation of the building. So these pictures are some final images from the YSB project. On the left is sort of the grand opening where some of the funders and the city officials came to celebrate and the opening of the building. And then on the left is a picture of one of the units ready for tenants to move in. So to recap, for any development project to be successful, you need all three of those components: capital, land, and capacity. And you might have one before the others, and sometimes it takes time to get all three, but they're all necessary, and you really can't move on until you can answer you know, what are you going to do for each of those pieces? The timeline varies significantly. Sometimes a group comes in and knows exactly what they want to build, and they have the money in place, and feasibility could take a couple of months, whereas others work for over a decade before they are able to move on from that stage. There's a considerable amount of work to do before a shovel touches the ground, and there's significant costs before you get to the construction stage. And that's something that's really important to be aware of, just so groups sometimes get surprised, you know, at how much needs to be spent for all of those studies and the design work before construction starts. And feasibility really is the key. You really need to be certain that your project is ready to move ahead. And that's in order to manage the risk. So making sure that all the questions have been answered before moving on prematurely. So as we described in the last section, it's a complex process to get through a development process. And so your development team and the people you bring on board are really key to success. The project, as we think about it, there are 4 key members to the project team. There's the housing provider, who's the owner of the site, or the operator of the site, or you can think of them as a developer. So it's the group who's really leading the project, who's bringing the land and the money. The project manager is the coordinator, who brings the housing provider, often brings the capacity that group may not have, and that's what CADCO does. And then your key consultants, which are the architect and the construction manager. And the architect isn't designing the whole project on their own, so they have a whole, you know, roster of sub-consultants and engineers who are usually contracted under them to help design the building. And then the architect is the one coordinating back with that core project team. And similarly with the construction manager, they don't actually build the project themselves, but they procure and monitor and supervise all of the trades and suppliers in the project and are that key link back to the core team. So, you know, those are the core team members, but there are other groups that you need to have a successful project, and knowing who these are in that feasibility stage is pretty important. So, you know, we mentioned before the housing provider, that's, you know, we can think of them as the developer. The project team, those core members we mentioned on the previous slide. You also need to know who's going to operate the building, who's going to do your maintenance once it's up and running, who's going to deal with rent checks and show apartments when they come available. So that's a core piece. Support services, if you're a group who does support services, or if you're going to partner with support agencies, knowing who those are at the beginning of the process, because sometimes there are design criteria that need to be addressed, and just knowing where that's going to come from. You need money to do your project, and that's where the funders and the lenders come in, and that can be CMHC or, you know, a city grant or a private bank. And then the regulators, who are sort of the groups, maybe it's a municipality, or if you have a grant, often they have requirements that they put on your project, and those groups can be really key allies. So working closely with them is important. Now, these different team members can sort of come together in a project in different ways. We thought that using an example could help. So Graham mentioned the Beaver Barracks project when he was introducing CCOC. That's kind of CCOC's flagship project. So thinking about that, in that case, CCOC is the housing provider. They're landlord. They're also the property manager. They do property management in-house. And then CADCO, as the project manager, is also part of CCOC. So really those top 3 groups were all one in that case. CCOC isn't a supportive housing provider, but we partner with other groups to, you know, whose clients are tenants of CCOC. So that's the support services side. And then that project had funding from a number of levels of government, from the City of Ottawa, from Infrastructure Ontario, and others. As another example, we're also working on a project with the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa, and that's a project that's in design development right now, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end when we go through our project examples. But in that case, the diocese is the housing provider. They own the land, and they're really leading the project. They've hired CADCO, and they have an architect and a construction manager on board to bring that capacity and see the project through as the project team. But they're the Anglican diocese. They certainly know property management because they have managed churches and have lots of real property, but they're not the landlord. They don't manage renting units and fixing toilets when things break. And so they had to figure out who was going to do that.
I
Okay,
think
Anna, I
Anna
don't-
muted again.
yeah, you're frozen.
The tricky thing when somebody freezes, you don't know if they're going to unfreeze at some point or if their words all just lag. So I'll pick up from where Anna was presenting there. The challenge is that she's actually the one controlling the slides.
Do you want to maybe still just do this slide? And if she's
Yeah.
not back, I can share my screen.
Sure, sounds good. So maybe you can queue up the deck.
Yeah, I've got
So
it.
just as Anna was saying, we're working on a project with the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa, Christchurch Bells Corners, and it's in a suburb of Ottawa, Western Ottawa, called Bells Corners. It's an old rectory. So as Anna was saying, in that case, the diocese is actually the housing provider and kind of taking the risk as the developer. We're the project manager. They don't do the typically property management or are a landlord, but the Diocese of Ottawa actually wholly owns 6 charities that do many different work, from homelessness work to affordable and supportive housing. One of them is Cornerstone Housing for Women. They own and operate a women's shelter and other supportive and transitional housing buildings for women. And so the diocese partnered with Cornerstone, their kind of ministry, as they like to call it, community ministry, and that community ministry is actually providing the property management for the site. The site is redeveloping a former rectory, and for the last 20 years, the rectory has actually been the office for the local community resource center, and they provide services to seniors in that western suburb of Bells Corners. And they also do support services, and they operate a shelter for women fleeing domestic violence in that area. So they're actually going to provide the support services to the tenant. Not 100% of the units are going to be women who need support services. It's going to be a mixed housing building with units for single households and families, but there is going to be an emphasis on that. About 30 to 40% of the units will be for women who receive supports, and some of them will be the women fleeing domestic violence from that local shelter. And this community resource center will provide the support services. So there's an example where the housing provider, the project team, the property manager, and the support services are all different organizations kind of coming together to partner, and each of them is playing the role that really suits them best, that suits their strength. Great, Kyla, can you advance the slide?
Is it advancing?
No.
No. Okay.
Not on my screen.
Yeah, because it looks like I have the next one.
I might be back. Can you hear me again?
Now you're back.
Sorry, everybody. I can try to share my screen again, or if we think it's not.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Anna. Because Kyla was having a difficulty advancing that slide there. Sorry about this, everybody.
Sorry, everyone. Just give me a second. I think the screen will come back.
You should be on 34 now, Anna. You can go to the next one.
Yes. Do you see the screen again?
Yep.
From my computer?
Yep, we're good.
Okay. So now we're on development team takeaways. Is that what you see?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I think we're back. So thank you for picking up there. So yeah, really the development team makes all the difference to a project. Having a strong team is going to make the difference between, looking back on a project and thinking, that was amazing. There are, a group having momentum to think of what's our next project. Let's keep developing affordable housing. Let's do this again. And thinking back and, everything's been a headache and everyone's exhausted and not wanting to go through that experience again. So it really is key. And the key to that is identifying your organization's strengths. So, some groups are amazing supportive housing groups, and what they really specialize in is the supportive housing side of things, but they don't necessarily have the development expertise. And so hiring somebody to help with that side of things. You know, if a group is going to do a major fundraising campaign and hasn't done that before in your project, and bring in that expertise to your team. And so, yeah, really just that identifying the strengths needed from other members to fill in the gaps. So we're going to take another pause for questions here, if there's anything.
Yeah, we've got a few questions related to the development process, Anna. The first one is, can you describe what a tender is and talk a bit about the tendering process?
Sure. So tender is usually used in construction world, but it's procurement during construction. So the hiring of the sub-trades. So, you know, you have your construction manager, but then you also need to hire the drywaller and the, you know, painters and all of those pieces, and who's going to supply the windows. And so probably a construction manager may have 50 to 100 contracts under them. And that process of hiring all of those people is the tender process. And they usually go out, it's a competitive process. They go out and get multiple bids for each of those individual contracts, and then bring them back. And as the developer or the housing provider, they'll review those with you. So they normally will bring those back and say, okay, this is the low bid. Or if it's not a low bid and they think that somebody else is better, then you'll have a conversation about that.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks. The next one is, at what development stage do you need to have the government grants confirmed?
So often that is the piece that lets you move on from feasibility. So that is the money. Often that is that leg. Graham's going to talk some more about this in the next section. So I think that's a good transition. But until you have that major government grant that's usually required for any affordable housing project, you don't really have a feasible project. So it's at the point where that grant is confirmed that usually gives you the ability to say, okay, we can do this. You know, we can move on to design development. We can figure out all of the details. We know we can spend that money and move ahead because we have the support of this grant.
Great. And then at what stage is community engagement and consultation both required and important?
So it's important in different ways all the way through, and it depends who you're consulting with. So I think at the beginning of a project, you know, often maybe you're working within your group a little bit more, but often there are different stakeholders there already who you need to be consulting and talking with. At the very beginning, you sometimes want to be a little bit careful with wider community. You don't have a project yet, right? You're trying to figure out whether your project is possible. And so sometimes going out too early and talking to the community can people get ideas in their head, and they'll love a project, and then when it changes, you know, if you show them your concept plan and then you come back to them later on with a different concept plan because you had to cut costs or something happened, then people get really upset. Or, you know, maybe you had to make a taller building, and you know, you can lose the confidence of the community. That also is especially important with fundraising. So often you know, groups are really keen to get started on the fundraising, but you don't want to go out and start gathering support before you're ready. Because if you get money for your project and then it doesn't go ahead, or, you know, takes a pause, you've maybe burned people who are potential supporters. But that being said, you usually want to have gone out to the community before you'd start with any planning processes, because you're going to need to do community consultation at that point. So if you need a zoning amendment application or anything like that, it's usually better to get ahead of that process and already have gone out. And sometimes at certain stages of the like concept planning, you want input from the community as what your building's going to look like. And so as long as you're careful with sort of what images you show and what message you're giving them to.
Okay, and then we've got one more question, and I hope I'm interpreting it correctly, but they're asking what percentage of the total project does like this development stage cost? So kind of like before you're getting into, I guess, like the construction pieces. And then what maybe the sources of the funding for this stage are. And I've noted that Graham's going to go over some of these sources of funding, but maybe if you want to just elaborate a bit on the first part.
I think maybe it's worth turning it over to Graham, because I think we are going to go through that in this next section. And if you still have questions at the end of that, then maybe ask that question again. Does that seem fair?
Perfect. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, we're ready to move on.
So
Thanks, Anna and Kyla. You can advance the slide, Anna. So now we're going to get into how you're able to kind of make your project financially viable. And it's great that there's already questions. And as I said at the beginning, that's usually what people are most interested in talking about, is the money piece. It's not that any of the other stuff is not important. It's just that's the black box. You know, that's the part that a lot of people don't understand. And that's the part that if you can figure it out, gives you the confidence that the rest of the stuff you can tackle and be successful in. And again, we're going to do a whole workshop on this. So this is going to hit it at the high level. And I'm not sure I would have even answered John's question in going through this normally, but I will. And if there's other kind of more detailed questions, we'll get to those in the question part at the end of this section. So go ahead, Anna, and advance the slide to the next one. This is a little bit, again, because we're trying to present information here that might be applicable to many different projects. Construction, new construction, or acquisition rehab, supportive housing, mixed housing, seniors housing. So if this at this level doesn't quite get to what you're looking at, you can ask specific questions about your own project, or even after this presentation, if you want to follow up with this, we're happy to talk to you about your specific project. On the left, you're going to see somebody with their juggling pins, and what they're juggling is the government, the mission, and the market. Wouldn't it be great if we could juggle the government and the market and achieve mission? What we are trying to display and demonstrate with this is that you need to balance all of these things in your project. If all you focused on was your mission, you would not receive the government money, because they have their own unique things that they're interested in achieving in giving groups money to create affordable housing. And if you want to create affordable housing where you take somebody off of the social housing waiting list in Toronto, one of those 100,000 families, regardless of the size of the project, doesn't matter if it's 7 units or 100 units, you're going to need government support. You're going to need a government grant of some level. You are probably going to need their support in getting your approvals and maybe some exemptions for zoning. You're probably just going to also just need political support to convince everybody that it's a good idea. At the same time, you don't want to compromise your mission. That's why you're doing the project. Otherwise, you're not going to do it. If you're a supportive housing organization that, you know, provides supporting housing for youth, and you can't do that in your project, why would you ever consider it? But you need to be able to manage the market. And what we mean by that is things cost what they might cost in that market. I'm not sure who's putting those red inks on the screen, but it's not myself. But you need to be able to manage the cost. Often people, when they think about their achieving their mission, the affordable housing, they want it to be environmentally sustainable. They want lots of amenity spaces and supports for tenants. When they go to the market and figure out how much all of that costs, and they think about how much support they're going to get from the government, they realize that actually it costs much more than the government support, and you might not be able to achieve all of those things. So if you look at the other image, almost like the traditional recycling symbol, if you start at the top, if you have a site or you're going to try and find a site, it has its own criteria. There's land use planning laws and zoning, soil conditions. The site is only so large. It might be on a main street or on a residential street. You have your own criteria. You're trying to achieve something. In the Youth Service Bureau case, they were trying to achieve affordable housing for youth who are mostly single youth. And they were trying to create a hub where they could provide support services to them. That kind of translated into, or those things can translate into a basic concept. think of this, we're at this early feasibility stage. This is all at the feasibility stage. That concept is like a Lego block, or what Anna called as a massing, placed onto your site. It kind of describes in very simple 3D form what you can build on your site that's kind of meets the site criteria and also meets your criteria. From there, you can apply some basic assumptions about parking spaces, the percentage of maybe your contingency. If you're a not-for-profit, you might get certain rebates. You'll make assumptions about your architectural program in terms of your unit mix and your unit sizes and how much amenity spaces, and is there elevators or not elevators, and will you have access to the rooftop? Just basic high-level decisions. From there, that allows a group like ourselves or a builder, professionals to help estimate what the cost of that to construct might be. And if you're doing affordable housing as a not-for-profit or charity, you're not necessarily looking to make a profit. And so you need to find enough sources, and you need to find many of them, that when you add them all up, equal the cost of the concept. This is the exact same thing for market housing, whether it's ownership or rental. There's some slight variations on strategy, if it's market or affordable, ownership or rental, but it's this same kind of theory. If it's market, one of their costs might be a certain level of profit as a cost. And if they can't get enough sources where they pay for all the costs and the profit, then they might not do the project. And what our experience tells us is there's really no project, whether it's market or affordable, rental or ownership, that ever goes and after completing this in one foul swoop has a viable project. If you go and think back to the 4 stages, at the end of a project, we might have 100 versions of our pro forma or the budget for the project. And every time we go around this circle, we're kind of updating and creating a new version of that budget or that pro forma. And probably about 75 of those will come in the feasibility stage. So if you have created a concept and you've gotten somebody to help you cost it, and you've tried to identify what the financial sources are and they just don't match the cost, and you might only have 50%, that's typical. That's just standard. That's the way it is. And even in market housing, they don't match it. And you have to adjust your criteria. If you think about that CCOC mixed housing model, maybe we adjust the amount of affordable rents like ODSP and BMR, and maybe increase and add a few more market rents. Maybe we adjust the unit mix between 1 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms. 2 1-bedrooms can be, or a 3-bedroom can become 2 1-bedrooms. Maybe we can get more rent from the 2 1-bedrooms than the 3 bedrooms. Maybe you think we need a bigger building. Maybe you need a smaller building because building in concrete is too expensive. So you adjust your criteria. And from there, you might adjust your concept. You might not even be changing the size of the building, but you would be changing your assumptions that underline your budget. From there, you might update your budget and your costs. Your sources might change. If you created more rent revenue, maybe you're able to get more of a mortgage loan. If you created more units, maybe you're able to get more of a grant. Maybe you've reevaluated your ability to do fundraising and you think, you know what, we can actually do more. So you update your sources, and then from there you see, how does that compare to the previous version? Is it better? Is it worse? And again, you're going to do this like 50 to 100 times throughout the project. So don't get discouraged with the first few. That YSB project that Anna showed, the first image, which was the concept that never got built versus what got built, and it's a very successful project. It actually came in under budget. But when we got our grant funding, and we'd already even costed the project, and we received our grant, we then hired a builder, because our costing up until that point came from a quantity surveyor, which is a costing consultant. Our cost that came in from the builder was over $4 million greater, almost 50% more than the cost that we had been quoted before and what our whole project was, the viability was based on. We'd already passed the feasibility stage. We'd already got the grant. And in that design development stage, we worked with the YSB to kind of go through this process. And from there, they were able to go around that many times, change the criteria, change the concept, change the costing, change the sources. And in the end, they built the project. It still had the same exact number of units as when we got the funding and had that $4 million grant gap. There was no change in the level of affordability. We lost the underground parking garage, so there was a big change. We lost a little bit of amenity space, and we just looked to make things more efficient. So again, one of the things I find is often when we deliver this presentation, we think of it as basic information, but it can be overwhelming to people who aren't professionals and talking about this every day. And we find that often when we're giving this presentation, what people, they've kind of stalled. They're challenged with how do we move forward. Maybe you've applied to CMHC, but you can't get an acceptance, or maybe you tried to get a government grant and weren't successful, or maybe you're just scratching your head because the just numbers don't match. And I think the thing to take away is you're not alone. And as Anna said, you need to focus on creating a team that can help you solve that problem. Anna, continue on into the next slide. So again, this is again focused on affordable housing, and we're going to kind of focus this next little bit on affordable rental housing, because we think that's what most people here on this call and in general our projects are interested in. So here are the basic costs. It's very simplistic, but we don't want to make it too complicated. There's land costs. If you're buying a building, that might be the cost to buy the building. Maybe you're buying land, or maybe you own the land, but there still might be costs related to converting it from whatever it is right now into a project. You might have to demolish an existing building, or maybe it's just an empty site and you have to pay to get site services, digging up the site, put in the pipes and so forth. Those are the land costs. Sometimes people want to know, like in general, how much are each of these? It really depends as a total percentage of costs. It depends on the city or municipality you're in. It depends on your project. Sometimes people have free land, so that doesn't really get included. But if you're and a lot of our experience is in Ottawa, but I think this might slightly translate to Toronto. Maybe your numbers are a little bit different, but in Ottawa, probably like 15 to 20% of a total project cost would be land costs. And probably about the same amount would be soft costs. And then the remaining amount would be hard costs, which might be a majority of the total amount, but actually the soft and hard costs can be quite a large amount. Sometimes with a lot of our projects, it was free land, so you kind of eliminate that and the hard costs become a much bigger amount. Sometimes you're able to get discounts on your soft costs because the municipality might waive some of their fees and charges, and that might reduce your soft costs. The hard costs, you really can't avoid it. It's really the same costs as any real estate project or market developer. The costs are the costs. Occasionally groups, they get sometimes things donated as a hard cost, and so you might be able to reduce those, but a lot of times groups are thinking, how can we mysteriously eliminate or reduce our costs? And it's really, in my mind, the wrong place to focus, because often you're trying to do something that is quite difficult to do. Soft costs, they're the types of costs that you would pay for consultants, your architect, a project manager like CADCO, all of the various engineers and consultants, and it can be numerous. You pay all of the costs to the municipality, so that would be all of your applications and fees, such as building permits, site plans, zonings. Municipalities usually have something called development charges. It might be called different things in different municipalities, but it's the cost that you pay them that helps them pay for the services that they need to pay for to accommodate the new development. It will be different depending on how many units, how big your units are you urban, are you rural, are you suburban? And then hard costs are what you pay the builder. And as Anna said, you might actually just pay one construction manager, but they might have 50 to 100 sub-trades or contractors working below them, and all of the combination of all of that are the hard costs. Anna, go ahead to the next slide. Sorry, I'm just going to pause for some order. These are the basic sources. And again, this is really thinking about affordable rental housing. It could be supportive or mixed, could be seniors, but it's rental versus ownership. And it's affordable because market developers are not getting grants. We think of this as a book or the page. You read it left to right because that's where you want to prioritize the money and the time. Again, you can't do a project without a government grant, and obviously you want to maximize the amount of free money that somebody else will give you. That makes sense. The more free money you can get from somebody else, the greater level of affordability you can create in your project. But you're certainly not going to get all the money from government. And some of the grants, even though it's called government grants, some of the grants you might get might not be from municipalities or other levels of government. You might get grants from Toronto Hydro or Enbridge for developing buildings that might provide a certain level of energy efficiency. And so they're kind of helping pay for some of the costs for consultants and the construction to improve the energy efficiency and reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. But often you're getting grants from municipalities. It could be in the form of a capital grant. It could be in the form of a reduction in municipal fees or charges. You might get a grant from the province. That might actually come through the Toronto Housing Branch sometimes, or often. In Ottawa's case, that's how it happens. In Toronto, it would be very similar. It might have the name of COCHI or OFI. I think with the first Parkdale's Neighbourhood Land Trust acquisition, you had OFI money, maybe? And then now, more recently, and this is really only in the last 3 years, CMHC, or Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, has created something called the National Housing Strategy. And that's kind of what people like to say brought CMHC back into the game. And they're providing grants and financing to help create affordable housing in a whole bunch of different programs. The bottom one that we noted there is actually a new program that just got launched in the last 2 months with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. It was a program created to spend the money from the carbon tax. And since the provincial government of Ontario and other provincial governments decided that they didn't want to spend the carbon tax money, the federal government has taken some of it and endowed it to FCM. And they've created programs kind of similar to some of the Ontario Hydro Toronto, Enbridge programs to improve energy efficiency, but they're actually administered through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. It just got launched. You can apply now. And if you're interested, we actually just posted a blog today on the CADCO blog exactly about that program. So I'm not going to go into details, but it's a short blog if you want to check it out. Jake was mentioning that at the beginning. You can find it on LinkedIn or on our website. So again, government grants or grants are the free money from some other group that you don't have to pay back. It helps reduce your capital costs. You want to maximize it, but it's not going to be 100%, and it's probably not going to be half of the cost. Financing is money you get from somebody else that you have to pay back. It's a loan. It can come in many different forms. Of course, the mortgage is your kind of main thing, and you might be familiar from your own household. You might have a personal mortgage. Commercial financing, as the Van City folks can say, is quite a bit different and much more convoluted and complicated. And so if you have gotten a personal mortgage in the past, that's great knowledge, but you're going to probably need to work with professionals to help you understand how to secure commercial mortgages. That might be a bank, it might be a group like CADCO, or you could go out and talk to commercial mortgage brokers who can also be very helpful in giving you information on how you get a commercial mortgage versus a personal mortgage. With the CMHC National Housing Strategy, most of the money that they like to advertise is in the National Housing Strategy is actually loans. It's not free money. And fortunately, the government has found a way to provide really low interest, long-term amortization loans. The main programs are the CMHC co-investment program and the rental construction financing program. These are the main CMHC programs. With the co-investment program, you can get a grant and or a loan, but the grants tend to be fairly modest. Most of the ones we've seen are between 2 and 10% of the total costs, but the loans can be substantial. And as an example, for one of our projects, we're working on a project right now in construction that is affordable supportive housing for veterans who have been formerly homeless. And they just locked in their mortgage rate with CMHC in the co-investment program at 0.65%. And that's a 10-year term over a 50-year amortization. So again, they have to pay that money back, but by reducing that loan rate to so low, by extending the mortgage from what you would think of usually as a 5-year term over a 25-year amortization. If these are not quite familiar terms for you, again, there'll be that workshop where we'll go into them in detail. But when you change amortization to be 50 years, you can reduce your monthly payment for the mortgage. And by reducing your monthly costs, you can operate your building at less cost, meaning you need less revenues, and you can provide more affordable housing. That's kind of the key to operating affordable housing. Reduce your operating costs. The lower your operating costs, the lower your rents need to be, and the more affordable housing you can provide. There is other things such as social financing that many of you might be familiar with. When IL and I created the West End Food Co-op, we created a community bond that many people were able to invest in, and that money helped us to have the money to help open the farmers market and the store eventually that was part of the Parkdale Community Health Center. There's other examples. The Center for Social Finance, the community, CSI, totally had a bit of a brain fart there. Center for Social Innovation in Toronto is probably Canada's most prominent example of social finance, or the renewable energy wind co-op down at the exhibition center is another great example of that. And that can be key. We've actually done quite a few projects using social finance. It's a loan, but banks often see that as subservient to their loans. And so they'll think of it in some ways like equity. Jake just typed in to say that if there's any questions about banks and financing or any of these terms, feel free to reach out to Van City, because it's very complicated. We've done lots of work with Van City, and they're great. They're the friendly bank. They're the ones that you don't have to feel as intimidated by, and you can kind of call them up and ask those basic questions like loan to value, debt service coverage ratio. What do these things mean? And of course, conventional banking, the big banks, any of those groups, First National, they all provide commercial mortgages for affordable housing, and it's a big business. Next, we have partnerships. You might have, as Anna was saying, a partner on the project, and some of the money might come from them. It could come in many different forms. With the Christchurch Bells Corners project, on the ground floor is 2 different partners. One is the Community Resource Center that used to be in the old rectory. They're gonna have a new office space in the ground floor of the new building. And secondly is a food bank from the neighborhood, a community food center. They are renting a commercial space right now, and they're gonna end their lease and move into the ground floor of this new affordable rental housing building. They're both tenants of the diocese, who's the housing provider, and they'll actually be paying rent to the diocese. And by having that rent, it will help them cover their costs, and it means the project's more financially viable because they can get more of a mortgage based on that income. Last, those sources usually never, in our experience, never add up to the total cost of the project, and you will have to contribute something called equity. This is the same with for-profit market projects, and actually in for-profit market projects, they have to contribute much more equity, but of course it's based on making a profit, and so their profit pays back their equity, and that's what for-profit developers like to call their return on investment. But because you're not a not-for-profit, you're not probably thinking in a return on investment, and what you're thinking is, we need all of these sources to add up to our total costs, and I'm going to maximize the first 3, and whatever the difference is what my equity needs to be. And then when Anna was talking about the feasibility study, for your project to be feasible, you need to be comfortable with that amount of equity. Maybe you're going to fundraise, and maybe it's $2 million. Have you fundraised $2 million before? Are you comfortable in making that commitment before you move on from the feasibility phase? Maybe you have, in CCOC's case, we own over 50 properties for almost 50 years. And so we're a not-for-profit, which doesn't mean we don't have a surplus. And if we do a good job managing our housing every year with each of those buildings, we can have a little surplus, and all of that over time can add up as our equity into projects. Or sometimes groups, again, using that CCOC example, we have many properties. Maybe one of our properties has paid off its mortgage or doesn't have a mortgage, and we can use that property or asset and leverage it. And that can be help to put our equity into the project. Anna, can you advance the slides? So we just wanted to focus a little bit on the operating budget. And again, we're going to go into more details in the next presentation in September, because this is where people often don't quite understand how important the operating budget is. And I think, oops, sorry, my screen just flashed there. Again, using CCOC as an example, in our most recent project that we're about to begin construction in the fall, more than 50% of our, about 60% of the total cost of our project is going to come from financing. And the amount of financing that we're able to get on our project is based on our operating budget. It's not based on how nice we are. It's based on, can we pay back that money? And can we demonstrate to a lender like Van City or CMHC that they should feel confident in that we can pay back the money based on the operating budget. So in your project, you have revenues. This is very simple. They're rent revenues. Maybe some of your tenants get or yourself, you get a rent supplement, or maybe, as Anna said, that's a little bit dated, and in the future, they're going to call those Canadian housing benefits. So maybe you get a bit of an extra income from one of those. Maybe you have some parking that you rent, or maybe you have laundry in your building you rent. These are all various sources of rent. Maybe like the project we talked about on the Anglican site, you might have some commercial tenants and you get rent from them. All of those are your total revenue. Your expenses, again, very similar to often a market project. You have maintenance costs, you have to save some capital reserves for future rainy day repairs. You have the utilities that you might have to pay. Your tenants might pay the utilities in their apartment, but you have to pay the water usually, and maybe the gas and the hydro that's not in their units. If you're not property tax exempt, you'd have property taxes, and that actually can be, besides your mortgage, usually your next biggest cost. You have your own staff or administrative costs and insurance, and there's several other smaller costs in there, but those are all your expenses. The difference between your revenues and your expenses is what the lender or the bank will call your NOI, your net operating income. You think of that as your surplus. The for-profit group thinks of that as the profit, but that's the money that's left over at the end of the day after you do your operations that you're going to be able to use to pay for your mortgage payments. So the greater your NOI, the greater amount of money you'll have to pay for a mortgage, and the more viable financially your project will be. Challenge, of course, is that you want to minimize the rents that your tenants pay because the whole purpose is to provide affordable housing. So it is a very fine balance between trying to maximize your net operating income like a for-profit developer would, and trying to operate at a break even because you're a not-for-profit charity. So you do need to think about the NOI and how much you can have to service your debt. And usually banks will not lend you dollar for dollar. So it's often for every $1.10 of surplus or NOI you have, you might get $1 to spend in monthly mortgage payments, or maybe it might be $1.20 for every dollar. But you know, they don't want you to go bankrupt. They don't want to have to kind of call in the loan and take over ownership of your building because you can't pay your debt. And if you don't, they will. Doesn't matter who it is, including CMHC. And so because they don't want to do that, they won't, if you have $100,000 in annual net operating income, they're going to make sure that there's some left over after you pay the mortgage so that you can manage the hard times, like if there's COVID and not all of your tenants can pay rent. Anna, go ahead and advance to the next slide. So again, in the second webinar, financing and funding partnerships, we'll go into further detail about regarding the financial terms and including looking at the details of a pro forma and how to kind of refine it and make it more viable. We'll talk about an example where you kind of go around the loop and talk about some of the major considerations that have a bigger impact than others. But, as a little bit of a sneak peek, often groups, when they're thinking about, okay, how do we make it more viable, they're just focusing on the capital side because they haven't quite figured out that the operating side is so important. So they're thinking, oh, I need to make the unit a little bit smaller, or maybe we'll make the building a bit, some less units, or we need to charge, we need to maybe make it not as environmentally sustainable. But actually, maybe you don't need to do any of those things, and maybe you need to actually look at the operational budget. Do you have the right staff? Are they operating in an efficient way? Have you competitively procured all of your expenses that you control so that you get the best price for your money? Did you think about talking to the municipality to get a discount in property taxes, because what you're doing is a benefit to the municipality, and if you can get that discount, you can get more financing, and that means you don't have to increase the rents. So the takeaways are that every project needs a grant of some level if you're going to create an affordable rental housing project where people or somebody is going to come off the wait list. It's really not possible otherwise. And to be honest, you want to get as much grants as possible, and you'll try and get it from all levels of government. And if you have experience or you know other groups that have done it, then talk to them about where they got their money from, because I find that all nonprofits are super friendly and they're happy to share, hey, we got it from all these different groups. To get financing, you're going to need a viable operating budget, which means you're going to need a positive net operating income. And so you need to not ignore that. If you're doing 100% supportive housing and everybody is paying Ontario Disability Support Program rent, shelter rate, it's going to be really hard to have a positive net operating income, because for the most part, it takes, you know, as a kind of general guideline, about $500 a month to operate an apartment of housing. So if you're only making $500 in rent and it costs you $500 to operate it, then there is no surplus for any mortgage. And so sometimes groups who are doing supportive housing, it's harder to get the mortgage, and they're trying to get more of a grant, and they might have to fundraise some more or be a bit more creative. Maybe they think about social financing. And every project needs equity. So go ahead, Anna. So we're going to pause there, even though it was a shorter amount of slides, because that's where you kind of get into a bit more of the meatier content, and we're not going into all the details. And so we wanted to make sure if there was any questions about those aspects. Kyla?
Yeah, we've just got a couple questions. Somebody's asking if you could speak a bit to development versus acquisition and renovation, and kind of looking at it as a way to increase affordability. So some groups are kind of trying to move quickly and they're buying buildings instead of constructing something that's brand new that would take longer. And although it's faster in some ways, they're thinking that there might be other costs and challenges. So maybe you could just speak to kind of a few pros and cons, kind of in terms of affordability for those.
For sure. And I'm actually not sure I answered that previous question about how much money is spent at the design development stage. It's again a little bit hard for that question about how much is spent at the design development stage to answer that, because it really depends on the project and the context. But as a general guideline, I'd say probably 10% in addition to your purchase of your land. So if you bought the land, or if you didn't buy the land, and you're doing a $10 million project, you probably spent $1 million or so of cash before you get a shovel in the ground. And often what's important to know is the governments won't give you any money till you get a shovel in the ground. And so that's where the cash flow becomes really important. Going back to that slide about sources, you might get a few different government grants, get financing, some money through a partner or two, and maybe you fundraise some money and you had some money from some other sources, and you have a whole bunch of sources of where the total amount of costs will come from. That's really great. And that means your project is theoretically viable. You've matched the sources to the costs, but none of those sources will come in at the right moment. And so you need to find almost an alternative set of sources to manage the cash flow. And that's actually where the banks and Van City are particularly helpful, is because the grants kind of come in fits and spurts, and the banks can help you manage the cash flow so that you can spend the money as you need to pay for your expenses along the way. And now I've already forgotten your second question, Kyla.
It was with new development compared to acquisition.
So it's very similar with acquisition. You probably, if you think about the total costs, you might buy the building. You probably have to do some renovations. You might have to improve the state that's there. Maybe you're lucky and you buy a good building and you just have to do some very simple renovations. Maybe it's more extensive. So you still will have land costs, You'll still have soft costs. You might have to hire an architect or other consultants to help you through that process in the acquisition. And then you'll have the hard costs of the renovation, or sometimes people like to call that the rehab of the building. And in general, if you think about the sources of grants, financing, partners, and equity, that all still applies. You still probably will get your total amount of cost paid for by some combination of those things. Many of the housing programs actually do not easily accommodate acquisition. So even though acquisition might actually, and in most cases, will cost less per unit or per square foot, and obviously the building's already built and people already live there, or people can move in immediately, many of the programs, including the entire National Housing Strategy, do not accommodate acquisition. So it's a little bit weird, and they've realized this, and COVID actually really kind of blatantly pointed that out when you have kind of some market landlords who are struggling to own their buildings and might be selling them, and people thinking about, hey, wouldn't that be great to buy them and buy that existing apartments and make it nonprofit charitable ownership and have it continue to be affordable in kind of perpetuity. But you actually can't go to the National Housing Strategy right now and apply to the co-investment program for a project to acquire the building. If you somehow miraculously were able to acquire the building without the National Housing Strategy supporting it, you could then apply to the National Housing Strategy co-investment program to help finance and fund the repairs, but not the core acquisition of the project. Now, that's a little bit seems odd, but the National Housing Strategy was actually created as a supply program. They call it a National Housing Strategy, not an affordable housing strategy. Key difference. And so when they're thinking National Housing Strategy at a very, very macro level, and this is kind of the biases, sorry, Van City, of like the Main Street banking system and kind of mainstream thinking, they're always thinking about supply. So when the federal government created the National Housing Strategy, it's a supply program. It's not an affordable housing strategy. Most people who relate to it, like ourselves, just think National Housing Strategy, oh, that's the affordable housing thing, but it's actually a supply program. I've heard lots of rumors. I think they will introduce an acquisition program at the National Housing Strategy probably this year. There's been a lot of rumors about this. So it's kind of a matter of timing, but right now it doesn't work. If you want to buy a building, what you can do is go and get financing from Van City or any of the other banks and get CMHC mortgage insurance. And they have a specific mortgage insurance product for groups that are providing affordable housing. And that allows you to get a loan. Van City might be able to correct me, but I think up to 85% of loan to value. So if you're buying a $10 million building, you might be able to get a mortgage for up to $8.5 million, as long as, going back to my slide about the operating budget, your revenues minus expenses give you enough net operating income to pay for the cost of the mortgage.
Okay. We've got a few more questions before we go into our project examples. Somebody just asked why there was a bias to the new build, which I think Graham has kind of summed up
Supply,
there.
yeah.
Yeah. Jake also pointed out for the previous question about paying for that development phase, that VCIB has something called a pre-development loan fund that can be accessed with a solid business plan and performa.
Great.
So something
Yeah.
for people to look into. One question, it came in kind of while you were talking about the NOI, Graham, but they were asking how much surplus should they aim to have in a project and whether surplus was okay. So I think you've answered that surplus is okay and necessary, but maybe if you could kind of answer that first half of like how much they should aim for.
Yeah, again, that's really hard to say. You need to aim for the amount that's going to make the project viable. And that's a very specific answer. I don't know if this analogy will work for everybody, but I'll try and explain it this way. First of all, the pro forma, which is like the developer's slang word for budget, is many different budgets. It's a capital budget, it's an operating budget, and a whole bunch of other kind of financial schedules that all interact together. this may be a bit traumatic for others, but if you can remember back to high school math, do you remember in algebra where you had maybe two equations and there was an unknown, there was A and B, and you were trying to figure out with those two equations and the two unknowns, what are the unknowns? And if you have the same amount of equations as this number of unknowns, then you can solve for the unknowns. I'm not going to make you do the math, but affordable housing rental development is, and ownership is the exact same thing. There is a very specific formula. It kind of gets embedded into the pro forma. You can hire a group like CADCO to help you with this. It has exact equations, and those equations have unknowns, and those unknowns come out of solving for the unknown. And it depends on all of the assumptions of your project. If you think back to that circle that goes around, it's really what you're trying to do there. Often when a group hires us at the beginning to understand is, do we have a project? Is it feasible? They're trying to figure out, can we green light this? And typically what that means to them, when I described the sources, is do we have enough confidence to achieve the amount of equity that CADCO is telling us that we need? And the unknown that you're trying to solve in that analogy of the multiple equations is, what is the equity we need? So what you do is you kind of conceive of, again, the circular recycling symbol. You figure out your criteria, you create some basic assumptions and cost the project. You identify how much grant you might get. That's actually fairly formulaic. If you have some experience, then you can pretty much guess how much of a grant you're going to get from the different levels of government. And you can, and how much you're going to get from the bank is very predictable. They'll tell you if you ask them, but also they've got very, very exact formulas that are basic. They're not hidden. They use something called the NOI, as I described it, and something called the debt service coverage ratio. And then they'll tell you some basic assumptions on what you should assume for your mortgage and your term. And from there, you can kind of work backwards, as I describe it, in your pro forma to figure out, as you work backwards, how much equity will I need to make this project viable. And again, it's usually never zero, and it's never zero for the for-profit market developers either, but that's kind of, the risk decision you're making. With the Youth Service Bureau project that's supportive housing, again, the numbers went crazy at one point, but when they were making that decision, it was, I think it was $2 million of equity they needed originally, and they were going to fundraise. They have a charitable foundation, and so they, as the housing agency, went to it's a separate organization, so they went to their related charitable organization and said, for us to do this project, we need to fundraise $2 million. Can you commit to that? Are you confident we can fundraise $2 million? And they had to think about it, and obviously, maybe they even had to hire a fundraising consultant to help them understand if they could fundraise $2 million for a 40-unit apartment building. But in the end, they said yes, and that's what it gave them the confidence to apply to the government grant. And once they secured that government grant, they were able to move ahead, as Anna described, out of feasibility and into design development. Another kind of interesting anecdote, I want to go back, Kyla, to the acquisition versus new construction is, sometimes it's not always obvious what is the most financially viable scenario. And an interesting projects that Anna and I are working on right now relates to our sister corporation, CCOC. They have 3 old sites that each have apartment buildings on them right now that are fairly modest in size. They're about 8 to 12 units. And they were wondering, should we keep maintaining these? Because they actually are quite old and need a lot of repairs, and they're not great quality housing because of how old they are and the state of the buildings. We can only kind of make them so good. Or should we tear them down and build new? And when we actually did that analysis of what could we build on the site and how much might it cost and where might the sources go from, and we went around the loop about 50 times and it all balanced out. And then we looked at the BCAs, or the building condition assessments of those existing buildings, and compared how much is it going to cost to actually maintain these buildings from a capital side, and how much equity do we need to make these viable. And the amount of equity we needed to build a brand new building and tear down the existing buildings was less than the amount of money we needed to invest in the capital repairs. And so then it became a no-brainer. We can build a brand new building with actually a few more units of housing. It can be built to a passive house super energy efficient standard. It's all brand new, and it's going to cost us less money than to maintain the building we have. So that didn't seem obvious at the beginning.
Okay, I'm just being told that we've got 10 minutes left.
Yeah, so let's go maybe quickly to the slides, because I think we...
I've got 3 more questions, so maybe we'll just hold those till the end and go through the examples.
Yeah, we've kind of talked about many of these slides. So we'll just kind of go to them fairly quickly. Anna, if you go to the next one. This was the Beaver Barracks. It was finished in 2012. It actually includes 5 buildings and over 250 units. It was built to a high environmental standard of LEED Gold with a district geothermal system. And it has, you know, commercial tenants and mixtures of incomes and rents. When we do our financing presentation, we're going to go into details about each of these examples and how they were financed and funded and how they made the project financially viable. Go ahead to the next presentation. This is an example of a project that we finished in 2018. It's 42 units. It was actually an acquisition rehab. This building was built in the late 1980s by a kind of prominent, really nice architect in Ottawa named Kouachi. And it was basically kind of like a dormitory style for Catholic nuns who would come to Ottawa to study. For education. And they had, their numbers had dwindled. They were going to move to a different building because they didn't need such a big building. They were going to sell it. They had talked about selling it to a developer. The developer didn't want the existing building. What they wanted was the green space around it to do infill density. This is a neighborhood where homes sell for about $1.5 million or more. So they were just going to build single and family homes and townhomes for millions of dollars. And they wouldn't be able to make this project viable by buying the site and tearing this building down, and they didn't want the building. So in a kind of serendipity, everything lined up, the sisters somehow met Cornerstone and negotiated with the developer that if they sold this site to the developer at $1 million below the market agreed upon market price they were going to sell to the developer of, the developer would sever and sell that building at $1 million below market, and the sisters would kind of continue their legacy. And in a great story, it all happened. And there was a great, it's all supportive housing for women, but there was a great partnership between Cornerstone and an Indigenous housing organization where a certain amount of the housing there for Indigenous and First Nations peoples. Anna, next slide.
So this is another example of a project that is the most recent project CADCO's worked on that's actually finished. So this is the King's Daughters and Sons seniors affordable housing building. It's an interesting example because it's a group that has actually operated seniors affordable housing on this site for 50 years. If you see on the slide, you can kind of see a part of the building that's brick and then a new part of the building that's the paneling there. So they already owned an apartment building of the brick side that had 70 units for seniors. And they decided there was some extra space on the site and they wanted to expand. So they did a project where they actually did this addition and created an additional 58 units of affordable housing. And because of the demographics, it's a seniors building. All of the new units are visitable and 10 are fully barrier free for people with to meet accessibility needs. And 16 of the units have actually been designed as adaptable units, so for changing mobility needs. The next project, so this is the Christchurch Bells Corners project that we've used as an example a few times during the presentation. This is a project that I'm working on right now that's in the design development stage. So we're working really closely with the architect team and going through our city approvals for site plan right now. You can kind of see in the slide the white shape of the church over to the right. So this building is directly next door where that former rectory was. And so the new building will have 35 units and it's mixed housing. So there are bachelor 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units in this building. And Graham, we've both already talked a little bit about some of the exciting partnerships in this building. So the ground floor will have purpose-built office space that the Community Resource Center, who's going to have to vacate the rectory while it's torn down, will move back into new space built just for them. And then also a local food bank that has long-standing ties to the community and to the parish will also move in. And there's some really neat opportunities there. They're both organizations that deal with food. The Community Resource Center does the Meals on Wheels in the area, and they're actually designing and building a commercial kitchen so that those two groups together can really expand their offerings in terms of preparing fresh meals for Meals on Wheels, you know, offering nutrition and programming to the community and to tenants as well. And then there are also partnerships on the operations and support side with Cornerstone, who's the example in the last example, the group that Graham talked about on the Princeton site. They are a community ministry of the diocese, and they've agreed to provide the maintenance and rental and the operational services for this building. So I know we're really close to the end, so I will move on. We just wanted to provide a really high-level wrap-up. I know there was a lot of information here, especially on the financial side, and I think that next presentation that we'll bring back can make a little bit more time and space to get into some of those details. But we wanted to get across to you all today that, you know, there are many different types of affordable housing. It doesn't just mean one thing. Any affordable housing project, you really need those three core pieces. So you need money from somewhere. You need to figure out where that's going to come from. You need the land where the building is going to be built, and you need the capacity to build the project. And that can be, you know, requiring the knowledge, but sometimes, you know, maybe the executive director's done development before and knows how to do a project, but they also have their job being the executive director and don't have the time or capacity, and so need to bring on some support. And you really can't move on until you have all three of those pieces. A good development team is really, really key to success. And then, as Graham was talking about at the end there, all projects, all affordable housing development projects need a grant and financing, and they never add up, and you always need to come up with equity from somewhere. And really, the way that you get that financing, which is such a big piece, is to have a viable operating budget. And so thinking about that at the feasibility stage, and that's part of why, you know, knowing who those different pieces of your team and knowing who's going to operate and maintain your building, that's important at that stage so that you can put together that operating budget in a realistic way. So that is the end. I think Josh is maybe gonna just wrap us up a little bit before we can answer some final questions. I know it is 2 minutes to 8, but I think we can probably stick around for a couple minutes if anyone has a few final questions.
Yeah, so I know there's at least 2 good questions that are remaining, at least 2. So I'm going to make my final comments short. But I just did want to thank everyone for joining us today and giving us, you know, taking the time to actually sit through a long presentation about affordable housing, which started very general and then got very detailed. I do this work every day, and I can contend to you that the advice that you received from CADCO was at first very high level, but then became very nuanced and specific. And so I hope that you all learned quite a bit. I want to really encourage folks, especially folks who may be supporting their organizations in governance around future affordable housing projects, to attend the coming 2 webinars. The next one will be specifically on financing and funding. And then the last one will be on stewardship, so long-term stewardship. Once we have the buildings, how do we make sure that they're well taken care of? We have good plans in place and the capacity to do that. So I want to encourage your teams to send people to those. We're going to share this video, so it could be that you share, someone didn't attend today who you want to go to the next one, so you can have them watch this video and then come to the next one. But please do join us for those. They're going to happen in September, and we'll share the dates as soon as possible. The other thing I just wanted to say is that the goal of this training and the upcoming ones is to develop more confidence in our organizations and our resident boards in supporting the organizations in taking on these complicated projects. So I really do hope that after these sessions, you'll take a moment with your board or in smaller groups to think about what you can do to move your organization forward to the next steps, whether it's building capacity, finding new members to your team to bring that capacity, or other steps. So thank you so much for coming to this with generosity of your time and also the passion that you bring to the work. I just also wanted to say that we had 55 people on this call at the top end of the call, and right now, 2 hours in, we have 49 people. So that just, for me, it exemplifies how much Parkdale cares about the development of affordable housing, that so many of us have been able to hold through a long presentation and are still here while we have so many other things to do, obviously. So we're at the end, so if you need to drop off, that's fine, but we do have 2 more questions, one coming from the Health Center, the other one coming from the Land Trust Chair, that we do want to make sure get answered before we fully kick you out. Thank you all.
Great. Okay, so this question's actually, maybe Graham, if you could answer it. It kind of stems from the very early part of the presentation, but they're asking what the mixed housing model's approach to understanding of difference in socioeconomic status. They're asking for a bit more clarity on the snow globe analogy for this, because they were kind of reminded of maybe like melting pot or assimilation. So they're just hoping for a bit more clarity around that. And you're muted, Graham.
Thanks for that, Kyla. I'm not sure I totally understand the nuance of the question, but in the mixed housing model, it's an apartment building where some of the people who live there are paying, typically, as Anna said, maybe a market rent. That could theoretically be anybody on this call, regardless of your income. And then others are people who would have qualified for some type of subsidy or a discount, maybe came off of the social housing waiting list, and they're living in the same apartment building as somebody who's just paying a market rent. In the CCOC example, actually, I think we determined the other day 3 of the 10 CADCO staff live at CCOC apartments, including Anna. Anna obviously is gainfully employed and she pays market rent. And somebody else in her building might be receiving a discount, but Anna wouldn't know unless that person's told her one-on-one. And when Anna moves out, hopefully that doesn't happen, but if she did move out, then she might be replaced by somebody who's getting a subsidy. Or if somebody who's getting a subsidy moves out, somebody who's not getting a subsidy paying a market rent might move in. Same level of housing, same quality of service, kind of the same thing, but just people paying what they can afford.
Great. No, I think that's helpful. Thanks. The health center is asking, how would they proceed if they have land but no capital? How would they develop or find housing expertise?
It's a good question. Certainly land is often kind of the key or the gateway to getting you to move. There is, as Jake was saying, and also with CMHC, there is grant programs where you can get smaller grants to help with early stage feasibility costs, like hiring a group like CADCO or an architect to create a basic concept. So CMHC has a seed program. City of Toronto probably has something. I know the City of Ottawa does. And so sometimes if you have land, you might apply to one of those groups and get a grant, maybe of $100,000 or something like that. And you can use that to help you with your first costs. And you might then start to assemble your team, as Anna said, and maybe hire somebody to help complement the expertise you have. Even if you're actually really super knowledgeable about affordable housing and have done developments in the past, you still might need to hire a project management development consultant because, as Anna said, it's a lot of time and energy. And so you just can't do it off the side of the desk of an ED or a finance director. So you still might need to hire somebody to assist, but look at those kind of early stage free monies. They can often help you cover costs. So you don't have to feel like it's as big of a risk.
Great. This next one will be, I think, pretty straightforward. They're asking if the contribution of land is considered equity. And in terms of thinking of like churches that are property rich but cash poor, would their equity be the land that they're bringing?
Yeah, absolutely. Land is part of the total cost. And if you think of the total costs and the sources need to match the total costs, even if the land is free, you can assign a market value to it. You can hire experts to help you understand what that might be, depending on the zoning and the size and the location. And if you already own that, then a group like Van City or CMHC, they'll recognize that value as part of the total cost. And if you own it, that is equity. Now, having said that, you need to go back to those first principles of you need to pay for your total costs. And so if you have free land and you have some soft costs and hard costs in addition to that, you need to find the grants and the loans and the other sources to pay for all of those actual costs. And if you don't get enough grant and don't have enough of a loan to equal your total sources, then you still might need to contribute further equity in addition to the land. So free land might not be enough.
Right. And then this is, I think so far the last question, unless anything else kind of trickles in here. But if all projects need grants, then one is maybe never able to build affordable housing without free input. But they're kind of thinking that if there's no land acquisition cost, for example, a First Nation community, could you not finance the construction where revenues do not fail to balance expenses, including debt?
We kind of say it like it's an absolute rule that every project needs equity, and we really emphasize that because in our experience, every project we've worked on has needed equity. But it doesn't mean that theoretically you can't create a project without equity, particularly if you have free land. But it really is going to be very hard and it's very rare. It means you're going to have to find more grants and you're going to have to get more financing, which means a higher net operating income. And the reason why our projects typically need equity is because there's a fine balance in how much financing you want to get because you're trying to provide affordable rents. And if you don't provide those, then you won't do the project. And if you don't provide those, then you won't get the government grant. So if it usually, when it kind of balances out at the end, you probably will need some equity, but certainly you can adjust the parameters such that theoretically you could create a project without any equity. It's just we haven't worked on one. And I'm not quite sure if I know many.
Great. Okay, that's the end of the questions. Maybe I'm just going to point out, somebody mentioned, about people getting together to discuss, like, if people have different legs of the stool and getting those groups together. And I don't know if Graham or Anna wants to kind of mention, like, these happen in projects in Ottawa quite often. So I don't know if you guys want to just do a
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think like that's I think it was John who mentioned that. Like, it's a really logical example. So Anna's example of the Christchurch Bells Corners was a great example where, the diocese had land. It partnered with somebody who could help provide the property management. It didn't want to do that. It partnered with somebody else who could provide the support services. When they all worked out all the financials, they actually needed to do some fundraising. They didn't have that expertise. I mean, churches certainly have a lot of social capital and they can appeal to the parishioners and others for fundraising, but they weren't professional fundraisers. So they actually hired a fundraising consultant. They needed to raise $1.5 million. Turns out for $150,000, you can hire a professional to raise $1.65 million. And therefore, they're paying for themselves. So as long as you have what they would call an appealing case for a donor, and that's what the consultant is there to help you with. So yeah, things to keep in mind is if you have land, and maybe Josh, you can think about a forum as to how people can kind of share what they have and what they're looking for.
I think this is an appropriate time to wrap up fully. Definitely this idea actually of this webinar came together through a meeting of nonprofits in the neighborhood with VCIB, looking at what opportunities existed and what challenges also needed to be worked through to see affordable housing get built. And this is one of the first challenges, which is just actually building our knowledge about the process so we feel prepared to begin the process in some cases. But definitely we are committed as a group of partners, like not just the Land Trust, but also many of the other organizations, the co-ops, Park, the health center, to continue to meet and see how we can work together to serve the community well and develop more affordable housing. So we'll definitely coordinate to make that happen. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, CADCO, for sharing your experience and knowledge and putting so much amazing work into this presentation.